Good morning, everyone. My name is Ariella Wagner. I'm the founder of SunRay Construction Solutions, a national preliminary notice service. And today we have a fabulous webinar, a three-part series that is going to be conducted by the absolute spectacular Danielle Maya. The first webinar is Tricks You Can't Miss on Securing Payments. And just a little bit of background on Danielle Maya. She is a construction lawyer. She has 20 years of experience. Her practices encompasses all areas of construction law, including construction defect litigation, lien law, bond claim law, building code violation defenses, OSHA defenses, construction license issues, and contract review. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Danielle Maya.
Ariella, thank you so much. I couldn't be more excited to be presenting this to folks today, and I'm working in conjunction with you, and thank you so much for everything that you did in making this really more interesting with all of the work on the PowerPoint. So, good morning, and howdy, y'all. Is there anyone here today that really likes it when they do not get paid on a project? I'm not hearing anything. I'm not seeing anybody say me too. So here I'm going to share some secrets for increasing your chance of making money on your Texas projects. I know no one likes to work for free, but unfortunately, if you're doing work in Texas, you may end up working for free if you do not follow the very complicated notice and lien requirements. It has actually been said that Texas is the most complicated and confusing state for perfecting and filing mechanics liens. However, the mechanics lien is still your best option for getting paid on private construction projects. So today, we're going to try to start our first step in untangling the Texas lien and bond claim process. We'll focus on private projects and subcontractors today. Next week, we'll be doing private projects. I'm focusing on original contractors, manufacturers of specially manufactured materials, and also retainage. And the following week, we'll be doing bonded projects. So we're hoping that you'll come away from today understanding what tier you fall in, why it's important to know your tier, whether you're working on a bonded project or not, the types of notices to send, and what time frame you need to send them in. So today, again, the focus is subcontractors for commercial and residential. Now, one of the reasons that Texas is really confusing is because the terminology is confusing. There's often many different terms that refer to the same thing. For example, the notice in a lot of states, you send out a notice when you your time clock starts ticking from when you start work on the project. Well, in Texas, it's from when you stopped getting paid on the project. So, and then there's lots of different notices that are involved other than not getting paid. Mechanics lien, again, is still your best option to get paid on the private projects. So how do you get your information? Some states actually require an owner to file something called a Notice of Commencement in the real property records, and this actually has all the good information that you would need about a project, so you don't have to scramble at the end to try to figure out who do I send the notices to, what do I need to put in my notice, you know, how do I lien the project. Since Texas does not have this Notice of Commencement, it's critical that in the beginning of the project, before you even start work on the project, you send out a request for information. And I've combined it. I've got it right here up on the screen. It's labeled Notice of Retainage. I would label it Notice of Retainage / Request for Information. If you have retainage on the project, then you want to notice as soon as you start working, or even before you start working, let the owner know that there's retainage on the project. Obviously, if you've got a contract with the owner's already going to know that there's retainage on the project. So this is if you don't have a contract with the owner and retainage is being taken out. This is when you'll need to make sure and add that in. So here's the things that you're going to be asking for so that you're armed with all the information you need. You're going to ask for a legal description of the property that's being improved. It's not critical that you have to have the exact legal notice of or legal description of the property in your notice, but you're going to have that in your lien, so might as well get it in your notice, get it nice and early. Don't wait until your back's up against the wall. You want to also know if there's a surety bond involved in the project, because then the requirements are going to be completely different. So you're going to request the name and last known address of the surety and ask for a copy of that bond. You also want to know whether there's any prior recorded liens, bonds, or security interests on that property where you're going to be working. So request the name, address of person having the lien, the bond, claim, or security interest, and the amount of any such claim. That'll also give you a better idea of your chance of recovering and whether you really want to even go forward and do the work on the project. You also want to ask for the dates on which the original contracts were executed. And we'll get into original contracts and original contractors a little bit later, but anything that was signed by an owner is considered an original contract. You also want the name and address for the owner of the property. And 6, 7, and 8, request the name and address of all the original contractors on the project. 7 is super important. You want to ask for the dates of termination or abandonment of the original contracts. Now, when you're just starting work, obviously there's not going to be any of those dates, but this request puts the ball in the owner's court, and so the owner has to, they now know about you as a subcontractor, and the owner has to put you on notice of all these things that are happening, and this is going to change deadlines for you on when you have to do certain things. So it's real important that you ask the owner to let you know if he's going to be firing the original contractor, or if the original contractor says, I'm stopping work on the project, or just ends up stopping work. And then the last thing that you're going to ask for is the affidavit of completion. An owner doesn't have to let you know when the project is complete. This is important for filing your retainage lien on the project. But if you've requested this information, then the owner has to put you on notice. And so you also include the language right at the bottom. If any of the above information changes during the course of the project, we request that you supplement your response within 10 days of said change. Again, this puts the ball in the owner's court. The reason we do this is you want to have all the information you need if you're not getting paid. The owner has to start communicating with you directly about the project, and this prevents the owner from shortening any deadlines at the end of the project or if the original contractor is terminated. So, what tier do you fall in? Are you an original contractor, a first-tier subcontractor, a second-tier subcontractor, a manufacturer of specially manufactured materials? Well, we kind of touched on this before, but if you have a contract that was signed by the owner of the project, then you're considered an original contractor. A lot of times, and this is where the terminology gets confusing, and these are prime contractors, these are general contractors, these could also be architects, they could be engineers, they could be surveyors, so anyone who has a contract signed directly with the owner. Even a manufacturer of specially manufactured materials, sometimes they contract with the owner directly. Sometimes they're contracting with the original contractor. So manufacturer of specially manufactured material can fall into two different buckets. They can be special materials and original contractor. A first-tier subcontractor signs a contract with an original contractor, and so they're one step removed from the owner. A second-tier subcontractor is 2 steps removed from the owner because they have a contract signed by a subcontractor. So, in Texas, if the property owner did not sign your contract, then you are not an original contractor. And you need to make sure you're not left out in the cold, and that's why you're needing to send notices to the owner so the owner knows about you, send those requests for information. So just to kind of put this in perspective for you, for lien purposes in Texas, it is great, wonderful, awesome to be an original contractor, but really only when you're doing commercial projects. Because if you're doing commercial projects, you don't have to send out as many notices. You have different deadlines, a lot more time to actually file your lien. So it's a pretty good deal. However, that all flips. It's completely opposite. If you're an original contractor on a residential project, you're going to have a lot more requirements. And we're going to discuss that in much greater detail in our presentation next week. So what tier, why is it important to know what tier you're in? It's important because it dictates the type of notice you have to send and when you have to send it, dictates your deadlines. So here's something that really sets Texas apart from a lot of other states. Every single subcontractor must send a notice for every month you are not getting paid fully on the job. I can't stress that enough. And you can't wait to the end and just send a notice out and say, I've been working on the project for a year. In the last 6 months, you haven't been paying me. That is not going to work. So regardless of what type of project you're doing, the key question is who did you sign your contract with? You know, if it's the owner, your original contractor, and you don't have to worry about sending out notices on the commercial projects. So if you're a second tier subcontractor, you have even more requirements than the first tier subcontractor that does. You have to send out notices earlier, and you have to send out 2 notices for every month you're not getting paid. Now, specially manufactured material means that it's material that can't be used in any other project. Often we see this with regard to windows that are sized specifically for a house, or it could be specialty ornaments. Sometimes we see that on roofs. Sometimes a copper roof made for a specific area of a house can be considered a specially manufactured material. So, types of notices, there could be as many as 6 different types of notices required, plus a filing of 2 mechanics liens. So, can't emphasize this enough. If you did not contract with the owner, you have to send a notice for every month you're not paid in full. Don't wait to the end. And the same thing applies to change orders. Don't forget about change orders. If you didn't get paid, if you did work in a particular month on a change order and you didn't get paid, you still need to send a notice for every month you didn't get paid on the change order. So the types of notices that should be sent out, the notice of retainage / contract termination, that's something that we covered in that first kind of notice and request for information. The notice of specially fabricated materials, we didn't cover that yet, and we're going to cover that next week. That's something that you send out early before you actually start work on the project. The second month's notice of non-payment notice, that's something that a second tier subcontractor sends out. The third month's notice of non-payment is something that a second tier and first tier subcontractors send out on a commercial project. And the notice of non-payment lien affidavit, that's something that you send out after you file your lien affidavit. And then the notice of retainage lien affidavit is also something that you send out after you file your retainage lien affidavit. So what do you send and when? For private commercial projects, the non-payment notices and liens, when does your deadline start? Your deadline start is from the month following each month in which all or part of the labor or materials were performed. So, for purposes of the notice, you're wanting to trap the funds in the hand of the owner. So in order to trap the funds, you want to send it out as early as possible, and you want to trap those funds before the owner pays the original contractor. And here's kind of the cool thing. If your notice is sent properly to the owner can withhold payments to the original contractor for the amount that you're claiming, and he can do it immediately. He has to actually hold the funds. He can withhold them, but he has to withhold them until the time for filing your affidavit has passed, or if you have already filed a lien affidavit, until it's been satisfied or released. But if he doesn't have any more money, then there's nothing to trap. So here's what you need to send and when you need to send it. If you're a first-tier subcontractor and you have a contract signed with the original contractor, you're one party removed from the owner, your trigger date to send that non-payment notice is the last day you worked each month that work was performed and not paid in full. You have to send your non-payment notice by the 15th day of the third month to the owner and the original contractor. You have to file your lien by the last day of the month in which labor was performed or furnished. Now that differs a little bit from that first trigger because that was based on what was not paid in full. But sometimes you're going to be on a project, it's going to be a year-long project, you weren't paid in March or February on the project, but you didn't finish the project until September. Well, the September date is where if you last worked in September, that's when you're going to start the clock for when you have to file your lien affidavit. And it is filed by the 15th day of the fourth month. And then within 5 days of filing that lien affidavit, you have to send notice to the owner, and you should send notice also to the original contractor. So I'm going to kind of walk through an example with you to give it a little bit more context. If you're a first-tier subcontractor, let's suppose that you worked in December, and you sent a bill in February for $100,000. Unfortunately, you were only paid $50,000 in February. So what do you do? Well, your deadline is the 15th day of the third month. So if you worked any time in December, then you have to send your notice to the owner and original contractor by March 15th and say, I'm still owed $50,000 on this project. You also need to include magic language that we're going to get to in a second, but don't wait till the last minute. Send your notice out as early as possible because you want to trap those funds in the owner's hands. So let's move on to another scenario. Let's say you also worked on that same project in January. You sent a bill in April for $100,000 because you had done $100,000 of work in January. You were paid $50,000 in April. What do you do? Well, by the 15th day of the third month, which would be April 15th, if you worked any time in January, you've got to send your notice of non-payment to the owner and contractor and say, hey, I'm still owed $50,000 for the work in December. You add that in, and then I'm also owed $50,000 for the work in January. So you keep sending these for every single month. You don't have to send them if you get paid in March and April. You don't have to send notices for March and April. You can just sit on these notices and wait to file your lien, and that's what's going to come into the next example. So let's suppose that no more missed payments. Your last day of work on the project was August 15th. What's your deadline to file your lien affidavit? So we go back, last day of work was in August, so we've got 4 months from there to file our lien, so that would be December 15th. You don't want to wait till the end, so unlike sending your notices to the owner and contractor of non-payment, putting those in the mail, certified, registered, is good enough by the deadline. But when you're actually filing a lien, you have to get it file stamped by the real property records by your deadline. So you have to send it early. There are some counties in Texas that are doing electronic filing, and so they'll let you do a scan signature. There's still a ton of counties in Texas that want original signatures that you've got to snail mail in. So do not wait to the last minute because sometimes they get rejected and you've blown your lien deadline. So second-tier subcontractors. Like I said before, they have to do things a little bit earlier, and they have to send one more notice. So the trigger date is still the same. The last day worked each month that you were not paid in full. You just have to send notice earlier. So you have to send notice by the second month. And here's where it's kind of odd, and it's unfortunate that Texas is so complicated. But that second month's notice is really only has to go to the original contractor. I always send it to the original contractor and the owner. And you don't have to really send that to the owner until the third month. you can combine these two, so you only end up sending one notice, but you have to make sure it gets to the original contractor and the owner, and that you send it by the 15th day of the second month. Your lien trigger is still the same. You still base that on the last day of the last month in which you actually worked on the project or furnished materials for the project. Your lien affidavit deadline is still the same, 15th day of the fourth month, and still you have to send within 5 days a notice to the owner. You should also send it to the original contractor that you filed that lien. So let's work through an example on that just to make sure it really sinks in. Same example as before. You worked in December, you sent a bill in February for $100,000. You were only paid $50,000 in February. What do? Well, 15th day of February is your second month deadline. So if you actually worked in December, you've got to send your notice out by the 15th day of February. And you send it to the contractor. You can also combine this and send it to the owner to say, I'm still owed the $50,000. Second example, you worked in January, you sent a bill in April for $100,000 that you were not paid $50,000 in April. What do? Yeah, this is a trick question because you've blown your deadline, so don't wait to send out your invoices, because if you actually didn't get paid in January, then March 15th is your deadline, because that's the 15th day of the second month, to let the owner and contractor, well, just the contractor, but you should send the owner and contractor notice that you didn't get paid. So that notice that goes out in March should include, hey, I worked in December, I wasn't paid $50,000. I also worked in January and wasn't paid $50,000. And if you send that out by March 15th to the owner and the contractor, you're going to be covered, or you can send them in delayed notices, but I think that gets more confusing. Again, your lien deadline would be the 15th day of August. I'm sorry, if you last worked the 15th day of August, then your lien deadline, again, would still be the 15th day of December. And in your lien, you could only lien for $100,000, and you need to break it out in your lien and say, I sent my notice to the owner and contractor by this date, showing that I wasn't paid for work I did in December and $50,000, and I wasn't paid for work I did in January, $50,000. So here's the magic language. This is what you want to send or put in your notice to the owner. And you need to quote this exactly. If this claim remains unpaid, you may be personally liable, and your property may be subjected to a lien unless you withhold payments from the contractor for a payment of the claim, or the claim is otherwise paid or settled. All or part of the claim has accrued under Section 53.053, and that's of the Texas Property Code, or is past due, and you insert your name there in the blank. ABC Company demands payment of the same. So that's the magic language that has to be in your commercial notices to owner. It should also go in your residential notices to owner, and you also need other special language in your residential notices to owner. You can also include, if you want, that this constitutes notice under 162.001 of the Texas Property Code, which is actually the Texas Trust Fund Act. And if you include that in there, it just kind of gives the owner a heads up, also gives the contractor a heads up that you know about the Texas Trust Fund Act, and that if they are not using the money, if the contractor is not using the money that the owner paid it to pay you or take care of other claims on the property, if he's just putting the money in his pocket and splitting town, which I've seen some original contractors do, that he could face criminal penalties, including a Class A misdemeanor or a third-degree felony. So here's the cool thing. If you timely sent your notice to the original contractor, if you timely sent your notice out to the owner, the original contractor only has 30 days to tell the owner that he disputes the claim. Otherwise, the owner shall make payment to the claimant. So you can also send a demand to the owner this is outside of the notice, and you can say, I'm making a payment demand to you under section 53.083 of the Texas Property Code. Send a copy of the demand to the owner and the original contractor. If the original contractor doesn't dispute that, after he receives it, he's considered to agree with that amount, and the owner, this is what the statute says, the owner shall pay the claim. So that if the owner still has the money and you sent this, original contractor doesn't dispute, the owner is supposed to pay you and pay you right away. So we've talked about residential projects a little bit. What is a residential project? A single family home, a duplex, triplex, or quadruplex, or a unit in a multi-unit structure used for residential purposes that is owned by owner, it should be by one or more adult persons, and is used or intended to be used as a dwelling by one of the owners. So here's kind of the key, it needs to be used or intended by one of the owners. So if you're talking about a multifamily development and you're not in contract with somebody who's going to be living there, that's not really considered a residential project. So we're trying to kind of keep that to true owner-occupied residence. So on residential construction projects, you have to comply with all the notices for commercial, and the timing is exactly the same, but you have additional requirements, and you also must send the notices earlier. So there's only one tier of subcontractors, only a first tier, or actually only a second tier subcontractor. So any subcontractor really fits into the category of second tier subcontractor under the commercial deadlines. So that means that the second month is when you have to send out your notice of non-payment. So the 15th day of the second month is your deadline. And then everyone, including the original contractor, has to file their lien affidavit by the third month, not the fourth month. So everything just kind of moves up a month. And we cut out that second layer of contractors. So here's the additional notice requirement that you need to put in your notice letter, along with that magic language that we talked about in the commercial notice. You need to include every single word of what's on the screen right now. And I'm not going to read through it with you. You're going to have it there. So just make sure you have both sets of magic language in there to make sure that you're doing everything that you need to do with that notice. So the mechanics. All notices must be sent registered or certified mail. In your affidavit, when it comes time for filing your affidavit, you need to swear to the statement of the amount of claim. You need a general statement describing the type of work and materials done. Here, it's important to give a good description. Recently I had a client who was doing drywalling and painting. His contract was a lot more specific on that for a multi-unit commercial apartment complex. But basically all we put in the lien was drywalling and painting, and that will be sufficient for describing the work in the lien affidavit. A legally sufficient description of the property. I always include the physical property address, and then the question comes up, what is a legally sufficient description of the property? Oftentimes your appraisal district records, your tax records, your property tax records will have a shortened legal description of the property. That can be okay, but sometimes it doesn't catch everything, and so generally, depending on how much is in dispute, we recommend that folks go to the real property records and include, a survey-like legal description in that to just make sure that they've caught everything. Now, all subcontractors must include details regarding their delivery of the notices, and this is what we touched on before. If you did work in December, you need to say, I did work in December and you didn't pay me $50,000 for December. I did work in January, you didn't pay me $50,000 for the work I did in January. I did change order work in February. I'm still owed $30,000 on that change order work in February. If you have retainage, you can file that retainage lien separately, or you can include it in your non-payment lien affidavit. But you've got to break out those amounts and give them separately, and say when you sent notice, I sent notice to the original contractor and the owner in January, in March, in February for the December amount. However it shakes out. Here's the good news. If it's a commercial project, so Texas differs from some states. A lot of states don't give you attorney's fees for filing your liens and also for trying to foreclose on properties. Texas, they have to. There's no discretion by the court. They have to award reasonable attorney's fees for filing of the lien and foreclosing on the lien. Unfortunately, on residential projects, the court has discretion. They may award attorney's fees, so it's not a slam dunk. If you have properly sent your notices, timely and properly filed your lien, your deadline to foreclose on a project for a commercial project is 2 years from the date when you were supposed to file that lien. In the residential project, it's 1 year. Now, here's something that you need to keep in mind. When you're sending out those notices, it's okay to be broad. It's okay to overstate a little bit on the amounts. But when you go to file your lien, you do not overstate anything. You can only lien exactly the amount that you properly noticed. So kind of going back to our examples, you had $100,000 that you properly sent your notices out on. If you continue working on that project, and in March he missed, $5,000, and in April he missed $10,000, and in May he missed another $5,000. If you didn't send your notices out properly on that, the only thing that you can properly lien, even though you think you're owed more, you've got change orders that you did work on, I don't care. If you didn't send your notices out properly and on time, the only amount you can lien is that $100,000. So don't overstate your lien, because if you do overstate your lien, you're going to be subject to filing a fraudulent lien in Texas, and there's all sorts of penalties for it. Greater of $10,000 or actual damages plus exemplary damages. So those are kind of punitive damages plus attorney's fees and costs. And there's criminal penalties. So not anything you want to do. Don't ever overstate the amount that you're owed on your lien. And that's why it's important to kind of have an attorney work with you on that, because I've found so often that clients, kind of take it personally because they're owed the money on the project. But if you didn't timely get those notices out and just check all the boxes, you only can lien the amount for which you properly noticed. And that kind of wraps up my portion of it. And I think Ariella is going to jump in here.
Okay, great. So let's go to our next slide. If you have any questions, you could just give us maybe the fact pattern, and we'd be happy to answer any questions for you. So at this point, it seems like Danielle did such a sensational job that we have experts on this webinar. And we're going to go to our next slide because we have a few more webinars that we'll be giving next week. It's part 2 series of our webinar. And Danielle can go into a little bit more what's part 2 about and part 3.
Thank you, Ariella. Yeah, part 2, we're going to cover also the commercial projects and the residential projects from the perspective of the original contractor, the manufacturer of specially manufactured materials, and also retainage claims. And on December 18th, we're going to cover securing payments on bonds. And the takeaway really from today is, if you're a subcontractor, you absolutely have to send a notice for every single month you didn't get paid. So if you remember nothing else, remember that, and remember your deadlines start ticking pretty quickly. So 2 months or 3 months after you didn't get paid, so don't wait.
Absolutely. If you go to our last screen, this is our contact information. As you can clearly hear from our webinar, Danielle is absolutely fabulous, well-read, easy to talk to. So if you're nervous and you don't feel like asking a question, feel free to send Danielle an email directly, or of course, you could send me an email directly. And we hope you have a sunny day, and thank you for joining us on our webinar. And thank you very much, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Ariella.
Have a sunny day, everyone.